Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
Main Street, Wyoming is made possible in part by grants from Kennecott Energy, proud to be a part of Wyoming's future in the uranium exploration, mining, and production industry, and by the Wyoming Council for the Humanities, enriching lives of Wyoming people through the study of Wyoming history, values, and ideas.
An American invention in the 1870s led to the end of the open range and the settlement of Wyoming. Can you name that invention? Join us on Main Street, Wyoming to find out the stories about barbed wire and brands, two tools that changed the course of Wyoming history. Welcome to Main Street, Wyoming. I'm Deborah Hammonds, and on today's program I have two sets of guests to share their expertise about barbed wire and brands. First, Joe Lawrence from Casper, one of our state's prime collectors of barbed wire, is with us. Later I'll be talking with Ann Noble and Bill Runner about Wyoming brands. Joe, we are surrounded with just a fraction of your collection of barbed wire. Can you tell me when barbed wire was first invented?
Barbed wire was actually invented in the 1860s, but the true barbed wire, what they call a barb, was invented in the 1870s, and the first patent was 1874 by Joseph Glidden.
So Glidden, that's the kind of barbed wire that we still use today?
Yes, He invented the first barbed wire. He had the first patent on it, and that's the one that was very popular then and is still popular today because it was cheap to make.
And so that's what people were looking like. Before that, I guess, what was it about barbed wire that made it so necessary in the settlement of the West?
Well, barbed wire, the reason it was invented is because, you know, the government wanted people to come west and settle the land because there was lots of it. The West was an open range at the time. There were big cattle barons, and so when the settlers came into the West, they needed something to protect their gardens and protect their crops. So this is actually what started barbed wire. There were three gentlemen, Elwood, Hash, and Glidden, all attended a fair in DeKalb, Illinois, in 1873, and not together, but separately. And these three gentlemen, one was a farmer, and one was a hardware man, and another one was a businessman, and they all decided separately to build a barbed wire. And what they were looking at the county fair was this barbed piece of wood that actually was barbed with nails and attached to the top of a fence. And they thought, well, now if that's a good idea, but we need something that we can fence our gardens and our lot with. So they turned around and invented barbed wire. The first piece of barbed wire actually was done on a coffee mill. Joseph Glidden took his wife's coffee mill and tore it apart and actually produced the first Glidden barb, which is this barb right here, on a coffee mill.
Isn't that something? So that's whenever you have someone in your house who's an inventor and starts taking apart things and stuff, think it may end up being worth millions of dollars.
And it was.
An idea that changed the West. Well, you mentioned some of these. Now, I know in your collection that these are your, what you call your exotics. Are they your
They're
most...
the exotic or rare wires.
Oh, okay.
The ones that are in these cases right here.
What is it that's so special about them?
Well, these are wires that were invented because everybody wanted to get into the act. You know, once barbed wire was invented, everybody wanted to get a piece of the action, you might say. So a lot of these wires here were invented, but they were so expensive to make, and they just did not do the justice to what they wanted it to do, that they were only produced for a little while and then they were gone. And they didn't survive.
Well, now, when you're collecting barbed wire, what are the things that you look for, you know, in terms of if it's rare or what makes it rare? You said you already mentioned.
Yeah, if there isn't very much of it, then it becomes a rare wire. For example, I found 3 wires, and I have them right here. They're all Glidden wires. I found those 3 in Wyoming, and so far, Wyoming is the only place that those 3 wires are found. Now, those wires actually are valued at $50 a piece. Now, when I say $50 a piece, that's for a piece 18 inches long, which is a standard collecting length. The thing that makes these different, and if you were to look at them on a fence driving down the road, they all look exactly the same. But when you start looking at these very carefully, you'll see that, if you look at this one right here, the barb is on a rectangular line. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Now it's kind of a square line. Okay, then this one, the barb is on 2 lines.
And these were these all Gliddens?
And these are
there
all
are
Glidden.
variations that he had.
The Glidden patent, well, what you're looking at here, the patent is on the barb.
Oh, it's the barb itself, not the wire?
Not the wire.
Okay.
And whenever you see a different type of a wire, that's a variation of a patent.
Okay.
For example, well, this one and the one I was holding, these 2 here, see, now that's the same
What a barb
same
that is,
patent,
huh? Okay.
but there's 2 variations. See, one's a small plate and the other is a large plate.
All right.
And these are the same patent.
Well, what about something like this where it's nothing but barbs? Where would this have come from?
That was imported from Germany. That's a World War I military wire.
Oh, man. And that's
see,
what
this one-
you have a lot of military wires that are part of your
Yes.
collection. All right, so
The barb that's on this one right here is actually what they call a 4-prong Glidden barb. In other words,
so it's 4 separate prongs that are twisted on there?
No, there are two different wires that are twisted together, and each one of those ends produce
Okay.
the 4
The
prongs.
4 prongs that are
See, this
sticking
has
out.
this has
It's
the
just
2.
the 2 prongs.
This has the 4. And that was German.
Well, what about the ones that have the wooden blocks in them? Why did they have a wooden block in it?
The wooden blocks and the metal blocks like this were used to so that the cattle could see them from a long distance away. That prevents them from, running into the fences and breaking the fences. But it didn't work out too satisfactorily because the wooden blocks were burned when they burned the weeds along the fence. They had burned the blocks too. So you find a lot of this wire without the blocks, but it's quite rare to find it with the blocks in like this.
So in essence, as attractive as some of these are, we're looking at a lot of failed experiments where people were trying to make some money and...
About 80% of the barbed wire were failed because they were too expensive. It's just too expensive to make.
Well, would this be an example? This one, like it has little spurs on it. Would that would have been expensive to make?
That's expensive to make, but they made a lot of it. And for example, there has been a lot of that wire found in South Dakota. And because of that, it's not really considered a rare wire. If you find a lot of it, then it's not rare.
Okay, okay.
But like the ones that we have in these cases over here, there may be 10 pieces, there may be 15 pieces, and that's all. That's all that's been found. And because of that, then they are considered extremely rare.
Well, tell me more about the collecting part then. How did you get involved in it?
Well, I was going on vacation over to Cody. We were going to go to the museum, and we happened to stop at the Holiday Inn in Cody, and right above where you register, they had this great collection of barbed wire. And in fact, I think they still have it.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, man, you know, that would look nice if I had something like that over my mantle on my fireplace. So I knew a couple of collectors that had extra barbed wire, so I got some from them. And then there was a show over in Shoshone, a barbed wire show. And I went over there and I got a few more. Well, I made up a real nice plaque and put it above my fireplace. Well, then I wasn't satisfied.
So to understand how unsatisfied you were with this, tell me how big your display is today when you go to shows.
My display is 75 feet long, on tripods, similar to this right here, and it's shown on both sides.
So 150 feet in total, and these are all
barbed wire.
Oh my gosh, that's unbelievable. That's
Well,
unbelievable.
I do show tools too. If you notice on the collection behind us, I try to show tools along with the barbed wire to show what type of tool is used at the time.
So that's a collectible also.
Oh yes, things that are collectible are tools, fence posts. You know, it sounds crazy, but you know.
I was going to say I can't imagine storing all of your barbed wire. What do you do? How do you store? What kind of fence posts?
Well, metal ones mostly, and we have a lot of collectors that said that if it wasn't for the fence posts, we wouldn't have barbed wire, which is true. You know, whether it's a stone fence post or made out of wood or the metal ones, but we have. People that collect the metal fence posts, and they have a collection that it takes a train to haul. So that's.
Well, and I certainly appreciate your gloves that you've collected up there. Anybody who's ever worked with barbed wire, you can't make gloves thick enough to work with.
All the scars on my hands are caused by barbed wire.
Oh, I'm sure. Now, something else I noticed, you have, it's not, this particular one is a flattened and twisted also, isn't it?
There was a few of these made that were made out of what they call a rail, or a flat barbed wire like this, and you can see one right here. Now these weren't rolled. You can't roll this like you can a regular barbed wire. What they did is they made this in like 10 feet or 16-foot lengths, straight lengths, and then they would put them on the fence, and then they would splice them.
Oh, Joe, I want other people in Wyoming to see this. I know you have a big show coming up, and if people just look in the newspaper, they'll be aware of where they can go and see this on display. It's fantastic, and I really appreciate you bringing all of this with you. Next, we're going to go to a segment where we'll be visiting with a historian and the state's chief brand inspector, who are going to be talking about Wyoming brands with us. Please stay tuned on Main Street, Wyoming. Supposedly, the Spanish explorer Cortez was the first to brand livestock in the New World. But in Wyoming, it wasn't until the 1870s that people decided they needed to prove ownership of livestock by putting their marks on them. Prior to that time, there simply weren't enough domestic animals in the territory. My two guests today bring a world of knowledge to Main Street, Wyoming about the history and the current uses of branding in Wyoming. Bill Runner is the state of Wyoming's chief brand inspector, and Ann Noble is a historian who has done extensive research on the history of brands in the Green River Valley. Ann, how did you happen to get involved in doing the history of brands?
Well, it was actually an outgrowth of the Centennial. The Centennial Committee in Big Piney and Marbleton decided that their lasting legacy was to start a museum down there. And their first exhibit was going to be on the brands of the Green River Valley. And when they started to gather the history of the brands, they realized that it was going to be a very large and extensive project. So they applied for funding with the Wyoming Council for the Humanities, and they require that they have a scholar or a historian work with them. And I was new to the area. I'd been there a couple of years, and I'm a historian, and so they asked me to sign on with their project. And I did, and my role was to train the people initially to conduct oral histories. I also wrote a questionnaire. I also had to do a lot of research myself on brands so that I could at least give them an educated questionnaire. And then after training them on how to conduct these, set these volunteers loose on the valley with video cameras and cassette tapes, and just waited to see what was going to happen. I thought that we wouldn't gather more than maybe 15, 20, 25 brand histories. And 6 months later, I was giving about 2 feet worth of transcribed tapes in which over 100 brand histories were collected from the Green River Valley. And my next job then was to plow through all this material. I learned an enormous amount. I then gathered the material to do a speech to kick off a display for the museum, which they had to move out of the museum and into the high school because over 200 people came. And then I wrote an article for it later on.
That's fantastic. Now see, it's interesting to me that there's that kind of material out there for historians, and yet, Bill, you're involved in the work of brands, how we use them today. I think before we get too much farther into the program, I want you to give us a quick lesson on how we read brands.
Brands are made in all types of forms. The single letter brands, insignias or figures. Brands are read from top to bottom and from left to right. There's natural letters for brands. An inverted brand or an upside down letter is called an inverted. 45-degree angle can be called tumbling. A brand laying down either on its back or on its front is called lazy. And then, of course, there's reversed letters that are used in branding also, as well as quarter circles, slices, bars, all types of figures. Your imagination is what your brand can be.
Well, I think that there's a lot of imagination in Wyoming because I know that there are so many brands. Just to give us a feel for it, you brought along your brand book. Can you kind of show me the extent of how many brands there are in Wyoming?
In this book, there's 26,800 brands. We also have 3 supplements that were put out since the '87 brand book was put out, with transfers and new brands in it also. I believe at the end of 1994, there was about 28,000 brands in the state of Wyoming.
Now, how many of those are actually in use?
I really don't know. I would guess probably a third or less are actually used, other than on belt buckles, barn doors, pickup doors, that type of thing.
Well, Ann, you brought some of the brands from your ranch. Your husband's a rancher, and can you show me what you have there?
Sure. My husband's brand is the LV brand, and that was originally his grandfather's. And this top brand is actually just a bar, but you can use this brand to make your L and your V, as well as making a bar.
Now, is that pretty common, Bill?
Yes.
That you'd have a simple thing like that, a bar that you could do variations. Okay.
The best brands are brands that you can make with a straight bar or a single iron.
And then the other two there are just quarter circles. My father-in-law's brand is a quarter circle F, and so you would use the smaller quarter circle on of course, your calves. You could never use that very large quarter circle on your very small animals.
Well, something I think that we need to mention, I'm looking at these and I'm thinking about branding of cattle, but your brand book, in fact, are all domestic livestock branded in the state of Wyoming, or?
Brands are recorded for cattle, horses, sheep, and we're even getting some brands recorded for buffalo and a few for turkeys.
I can't even imagine how you, I think people have to realize that when you brand sheep, you use paint.
Right.
Well, how do you brand a turkey?
They tattoo them under the wing. It's actually a tattoo rather than a brand.
Well, I don't think I'd want that job of tattooing a turkey. That makes branding cattle look a lot easier. And I know with your research, now we've got these different kinds of brands we're looking at. What are some of the stories that you heard when you were doing your research that you thought were particularly interesting?
Well, I think the earliest brands in the valley were the most interesting because those were the people that created their own brands. And the most common way to create a brand was to use your initials, CM, CC, double C, just different initials that you had that were either yours or your family's. The most common way to get a brand now, of course, is to inherit it, is to have it in the family for a couple of generations, because it is so hard now to create any new brands because they've almost all been created. Just a couple other interesting brand names. We're next to the Bar Cross Ranch, and that was actually developed by a mathematician. He used the minus and the plus sign for the bar cross to create that brand. One man at the advent of TV was so fascinated with television, and so he used TV as his brand. And one man...
That dates when he came up with his brand.
That's right. And another man was from Iowa, and so he used IOWA as his brand until he discovered that it was very laborious to put on and very hard to read, so gave it up after a few years.
Well, that's what I want to ask, is I'm thinking about all these different brands that you're describing. Bill, how on earth, I'm thinking of a brand inspector who's looking at a shipment of cattle. How do you read all of those different brands?
It takes a lot of experience. I grew up on a ranch, and so I started reading brands when I was just a little guy. But I've been a brand inspector for over 25 years, and it takes a lot of experience. The way we read brands are the change in color of hair due to the hot iron branding. Also, now freeze branding is legalized in Wyoming, and that turns the hair white. It doesn't create a welt on the hide, but it does kills the pigment in the skin, and hair comes back in white.
Are there very many people using that yet, or?
There are a lot of people using freeze brands on horses. For years, a lot of registered people have used number brands on polled cattle to keep track of the registration papers and so forth on them.
Well, now, I understand you supervise all of the brand inspectors in the state? Because
Yes,
now, how many do you have?
We have 6 supervisors, 49 full-time people, and about 50 part-time people.
Wow, that's an industry in and of itself.
Yes, ma'am.
How does this work? Now, you have to inspect the brands at which point? Anytime that they're sold?
Anytime livestock is sold or transported across the county or state line, they need to be inspected unless the rancher has a range permit allowing them to go from one county to the other within the state. But anytime any livestock changes hands or is transported across the state line, it definitely must be inspected.
Well, I guess the question has to be, we've been branding these livestock because of the practices of rustling back in the 1870s. I mean, that's why they came up with this idea in Wyoming. Why do we brand them today?
For the very same reason. Modern rustlers use semi-trucks, horse trailers, where the old-time rustlers were only able to do it horseback and drive the cattle off. So livestock can be moved at a much greater distance in a very short period of time now. So livestock rustling is still very prevalent in the livestock industry in the United States.
Isn't that incredible? Now, Ann, I know when you were talking earlier to me, you were talking about some of the stories that you heard that came with the brands, and one of them was how brands can be altered. What did you learn about that?
Well, not much. Mainly
These
because,
are deep secrets.
mainly because it's something that people are not necessarily want to talk about a lot, and it was something that we had to deal with very delicately in the interviews. If people were talking about the rustling or altered brands, you had to be very careful on accusations, especially if they'd been a long time ago, and how it was handled. But probably the biggest thing we learned about the history is how sentimental and how important those brands are to the family. And that's why they were very protective of their histories as well.
Why do you think there's that attachment to them? What did you learn about that?
The personal attachment to the brand is because it's your trademark, it's your coat of arms, and it represents so much more than just an ownership of an animal. It represents what you have accomplished as a rancher, and it represents your land, your family, your life's work. And it's often more, especially at this point, more than your life's work. It's your generations of work as well. In fact, we came across, you were asking about how many brands were still active. Quite a few people in the Green River Valley have used their brands no longer in ranching industry, but have taken it to other industries and have kept the name, such as the Acorn Ranch was the Springman's Ranch brand, that he now uses to name his business. There's an artist down in Big Piney, Dealey Ball. Her brand is the AA. She now calls her artwork the AA Originals. So there's a lot of people now that are using brands to name their businesses, even though they're not necessarily ranching businesses.
When you talk about that, you inherit brands. If somebody did want to develop their own brand, how do they find out if they're not duplicating one that already exists?
They have to be sent in and researched by the Wyoming Livestock Board in Cheyenne. It takes a lot of time and effort to research a brand, and it's real hard to get good brands anymore. And by good brands, I mean possibly double-digit brands, or you can't even get a single-digit brand any longer. A brand is a cow's or a horse's return address, so you need some way of getting them home, and they got to have a return address on them.
We had some people who got their brands because they sent in brands that they had hoped to get, but the board rejected those because they were too similar to either brands that were already registered in that county or county next to them. So instead sent back to them, you can't have that brand, but here are 10 possibilities that you could have, and so they would choose one of those instead.
It sounds like that would be a luxury today. You probably don't have that choice. Well, I feel like we've just covered so much in such a short span of time, but I really want to thank the two of you for coming. I know that all of our viewers are much richer for knowing about the history and the current uses of brands. And thank you for joining us very much.
Main Street, Wyoming is made possible in part by grants from Kennecott Energy, proud to be a part of Wyoming's future in the uranium exploration, mining, and production industry, and by the Wyoming Council for the Humanities, enriching lives of Wyoming people through the study of Wyoming history, values, and ideas.